You're standing in line. Your phone is at 1%. There is nothing to look at, nothing to read, nothing to check, and within seconds, something in you starts to itch. You shift your weight, you sigh, you start counting ceiling tiles. But the real answer for why this happens is far stranger than you're just impatient. Your brain didn't evolve to sit still and do nothing. It evolved to notice, to scan, to hunt for something, anything that might matter. Boredom isn't a flaw in that system. Boredom is the system working exactly as designed. Think about that for a second. What if the most uncomfortable feeling in your day is actually one of your oldest survival tools? Psychologist Sandy Mann, who has spent years studying boredom at the University of Central Lancashire, found something researchers didn't expect. In one of her experiments, participants who copied numbers out of a phone book, one of the dullest tasks imaginable, went on to perform better on a creative brainstorming task than people who skipped the boring task entirely. Boredom wasn't blocking their minds. It was clearing space in them. Here's what's happening underneath the itch. When you stop feeding your brain external stimulation, it doesn't shut off. It switches modes. A network deep in your brain, one neuroscientist called the default mode network, quietly powers up. This network activates when you're not focused on a task. It's responsible for daydreaming, self-reflection, and something researchers call mind wandering. Saying mind wandering sounds like wasted time. It isn't. Cognitive scientist Jonathan Smallwood, who has spent much of his career studying this exact phenomenon, found that the moments your attention drifts are often when your brain solves problems it couldn't solve while focused. You've felt this. The answer to a nagging question doesn't arrive while you're staring hard at it. It arrives in the shower, and on a walk, standing in a line with a dead phone. That's not an accident. That's architecture. Go back further. Long before phones, before books, before fire even, your ancestors spent enormous stretches of time in a state we would now call boring, walking for hours to find water, sitting through a long watch at night, waiting for a threat that might never come. Idle hands, idle eyes, but never an idle brain. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have noted something important. Long stretches of low stimulation weren't dead time. They were planning time. Mental rehearsal, social bonding through unhurried conversation, time to notice a change in the wind, a shift in animal tracks, a pattern in the stars. A restless mind during quiet moments wasn't a bug in early humans. It was a scanning system, always half listening for the next opportunity or the next danger. A brain that could tolerate silence for a while, but never for too long, was a brain built to keep its owner alive. There's another layer to this that rarely gets mentioned. Boredom isn't only about ideas, it's also about people. Anthropological accounts of small foraging bands describe long evenings with nothing scheduled, no task, no destination, just people sitting near a fire with time to fill. Researchers studying groups like the Ju Huanzi of the Kalahari have documented how these unstructured hours were filled largely with storytelling, gossip, and social repair, the quiet work of mending a disagreement or reinforcing a bond. Boredom, in that setting, pushed people toward each other. It didn't push them toward a device that only they could see. That matters, because the same restlessness that once sent your ancestors looking for company now just as easily sends you looking for a feed of strangers. The itch is identical. The destination has changed completely, so why does boredom feel bad if it's actually useful? Because discomfort is the mechanism, not the malfunction. Boredom is your brain's way of saying, nothing here is worth your attention, so go find something that is. It's not a punishment, it's a nudge. The same way hunger nudges you toward food, and thirst nudges you toward water, boredom nudges you toward stimulation, novelty, or problem solving. All three feelings exist for the same reason. They protect you from staying still for too long in a world that rewarded movement, curiosity, and searching. Here's the twist almost nobody expects. The more available constant stimulation becomes, the worse we get at tolerating its absence. Philosopher Andreas Elpidoru, who has written extensively on the function of boredom, describes it as an emotional signal whose entire job is to redirect you when your current situation isn't engaging enough. That signal used to point you toward a task, a person, a landscape. Now, in most modern moments, it points you toward a screen. Same ancient wiring. Completely different environment. And that mismatch is where things get uncomfortable. Your ancestors experienced boredom in bursts, followed by long periods of genuinely low stimulation where the brain could wander freely and finish its background processing. You experience boredom in bursts too, but now the burst gets interrupted within seconds by a notification, a scroll, a flick of the thumb. The itch never gets to finish its job. What happens when you interrupt boredom before it resolves? Researchers studying attention and digital habits have observed a pattern that looks almost like a reflex. The moment discomfort appears, the hand moves toward the phone before the conscious mind even registers the decision. It's not weakness. It's a very old system reacting to a very new tool. Your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do, seeking relief from an unstimulated state. Except the relief is now instant, infinite, and never fully satisfying. Notice that word. Never fully satisfying. That's the part that separates old boredom from new boredom. When your ancestor got restless on a long walk and started noticing patterns in the terrain, the restlessness resolved. The brain found something to latch onto, and the itch faded. When you get restless in a waiting room and open an app, the app gives you 30 seconds of relief and then hands the itch right back, slightly worse than before. You haven't fed the system what it actually wanted. You've just distracted it, briefly on a loop. This is where mind wandering gets starved. Studies on mind wandering suggest it isn't just idle thought. It's linked to future planning, creative incubation, and even memory consolidation. The quiet stitching together of things you learned earlier in the day. When every unstimulated gap gets filled instantly, that stitching never fully happens. The background processing your brain is built to run gets cut off again and again, mid-task. Picture a computer that never finishes closing its programs before someone yanks the power cord. Ideas half-formed, patterns half-noticed, emotions half-processed. Not gone, just interrupted over and over, thousands of times a week. Consider how often this happens in a single day. A red light, a slow elevator, the seconds between opening an app and it loading. Each of these used to be a tiny pocket of nothing, a few seconds where the mind was free to drift. Now almost every one of those pockets gets filled before it even has a chance to open. The gaps haven't disappeared. They've just been preemptively stuffed. Some researchers studying attention describe this as a kind of erosion, not of intelligence, but of tolerance. The capacity to sit with an unfilled moment isn't fixed, it behaves more like a muscle, and muscles that never get used quietly weaken. The less often boredom is allowed to run its course, the more unbearable even a few seconds of it start to feel, which only pushes you to fill the next gap even faster than the last one. Do you know what that actually costs you? It costs you the version of the idea that only shows up after 10 straight minutes of doing nothing. It costs you the memory that only surfaces when nothing else is competing for space. It costs you the moment of noticing quietly that something in your life needs to change. Modern life doesn't remove boredom. It just makes sure you never sit inside it long enough to hear what it's telling you. So what does an unfilled moment of boredom actually give you back? El Podoro's research frames boredom as functional precisely because it forces change. Left alone with it, without an escape hatch, your brain runs its own internal cleanup. It replays your day. It surfaces a worry you hadn't let yourself feel yet. It quietly assembles a solution to something you weren't consciously working on. None of that happens on command. It happens in the gap. That's not empty time. That's maintenance. There's a reason some of history's most vivid ideas didn't arrive in laboratories or libraries, but in idle, understimulated moments. Long walks, long train rides, long stretches with nothing to do. Writers have described their best lines arriving while washing dishes, and scientists have described breakthroughs arriving in the bath, not at the desk. The mind, denied external input, turned inward and did what it was built to do all along. Your ancestors didn't have a choice. Boredom was simply the baseline of daily life, and their brains adapted around it, using it as fuel for memory, planning, and connection. Long stretches of nothing were the price of survival in a world without constant entertainment, and the brain turned that price into an advantage. You do have a choice, and most of the time, without even noticing, you choose to skip it. What would happen if just once you let the itch run its course? not forever, not as some grand challenge, just the next time you feel that restless. Pull in a waiting room or a slow moment. Let it sit for a minute longer than usual before reaching for relief. Notice where your mind goes when nobody is directing it. You might notice it doesn't wander randomly. It goes somewhere. Toward an unfinished thought, toward a person you've been meaning to call, toward a decision you've been avoiding. That's not your mind failing to focus. That's your mind finally getting the space to focus on the right thing. Even a few uninterrupted minutes seem to be enough to trigger this. You don't need hours of silence. You don't need a retreat, a cabin, or a digital detox. You need the discomfort to survive past the first 10 seconds without being rescued by a screen, and then, almost without effort, the rest tends to follow on its own. That's the part almost nobody tries anymore. Rescue arrives so fast now that the deeper layer of boredom, the layer where the real thinking happens, rarely gets reached at all. It's still down there. It just hasn't been visited in a while. Some researchers who study attention have started framing this as a skill worth relearning rather than a discomfort worth avoiding. Not because boredom feels pleasant, it doesn't, and it was never supposed to, but because the ability to stay in it, even briefly, is what lets the deeper process finish. Skipping it every time isn't neutral. It's a habit, and like most habits, it gets easier the more you repeat it, whether the repetition serves you or not. Your ancestors never had to relearn this. Their environment did the work for them. Long walks, long nights, long silences. All of it built in, none of it optional. Yours doesn't. Every gap in your day now comes pre-filled unless you actively choose otherwise, which means the tolerance your ancestors inherited for free is something you now have to practice on purpose. Boredom was never your enemy. It was the oldest signal you have, older than language, older than fire, quietly built to protect you by pointing you toward what actually matters. It kept your ancestors scanning the horizon when nothing seemed to be happening. It kept them noticing, remembering, and planning through the long, quiet stretches most of their lives were made of. Tonight, when the itch shows up again, in line, in traffic, in the space before sleep, you won't just feel it. You'll know exactly what your brain is trying to do.